Welcome, dear viewers. Today we are speaking to Belgian-Canadian historian Jacques Pauwels. We are dewereldmorgen.be, that's the world tomorrow in Dutch, a Dutch language news site in Brussels, Belgium. To be brief, we publish the news that's not fit to print in the mainstream or that is presented in a biased format. We give a voice to the social struggle in Belgium, in Europe, and in the world. Our guest today is Jacques Pauwels, historian with a long career in academics and research. Although we are both native Dutch speakers, for the benefit of our international audience, we are going to conduct our conversation in the language of Shakespeare, well, more or less. For Dutch subtitles, you can click on the button, to your right on your screen. Jacques Pauwels is a prolific author with many books on the issues he knows best, the wars of the 20th century in Europe. His books have been published in Dutch, English, French, Italian, Spanish, German, all over. I'm showing you here the covers of the Dutch versions, but you can check his website, Jacques, it will be in the subtitle, jacquespauwels.net books. The Myth of the Good War, America during the Second World War. The Big Myths of Modern History, also important. Big Business with Nazi Germany. And to me, his most important work of all, The Great War of Classes. I don't know exactly what the English title is. It's a big one. It's a big one, 660 pages. But don't let that frighten you. It's neatly divided in 29 chapters that you can read at your own pace. But let me assure you, once you start the third chapter, you won't stop. Jacques is not just a prolific writer, as I just told you, he's also a gifted speaker. Jacques, welcome. Jacques, welcome is at war again, on its own territory this time. That's a change. In fact, one can say that Europe and its ally overseas, on your side of the ocean, in the US, has been at war since 1914. Well, even before that date, if not on our own continent, somewhere abroad, someplace in the rest of the world. Now, if you follow the mainstream news here, and it's probably the same in Canada and in the US, it seems like this war on Ukraine started out of the whim of this crazy monster in Moscow. No context, and important for you, no history. This leaves people totally clueless about the why and the how. Now, reading your book on World War I, one finds that the media and the elites, well, they never fight wars over the official reasons that they give. It's no different today. Now, one of your central themes, Jacques, is that wars are not just things that happen because elites want them or because weapons manufacturers and the petroleum sector make a bundle out of it. No, you take it a step further. You say this economic system, the one that we call capitalism, for lack of a better word, it needs wars to survive. Jacques, can you take us on a trip from 1914 to today, a century ago to today? How did we get so far? What can we learn from history to understand what happens today, Jacques?
Well, it's a big topic.
And yes, indeed, absolutely.
The war in Ukraine today is a very complex kind of an issue. It's a war that indeed, as you mentioned first, or at the start, we can only understand if you know the history, if you know the historical background. And that's a major problem with the way that our media and our politicians deal with this war, or try to explain it. There's a total absence of history. And I noticed here in Canada, as well as anywhere else in Europe, they don't allow the public to hear the Russian version of it. Or when there's some echo of what, for example, Putin said, it's usually minimized or ridiculed or dismissed as unimportant. I remember specifically a talk Putin gave some months ago already in the early stages of the war about the history of Ukraine and how it fits into the overall history of Russia. And immediately that story was dismissed as a fantasy, as basically just another bit of bullshit from Putin that we should not pay attention to. But the reality is that the history of Ukraine is intimately connected with the history of Russia. And in fact, you could argue that Ukraine has been part of Russia or was part of Russia for many, many centuries. In fact, if you know a bit of history of Russia, it's fair to say that Russia in some ways started in the western reaches of the land, first around Novgorod, near the Estonian-Finnish borders, and later on what was called the Kievian Rus, Kiev, Russia, which is actually what we call the Ukraine now. And many people would argue that Ukrainian language is really just a form of Russian, as Flemish is of Dutch, for example, or Austrian, one of German, so that the differences are really quite minimal. Anyways, we have to know history to begin to understand that war. And right away, in the short term, it would be important to understand that the war in Ukraine did not start this last February. It started actually in 2014 with a coup d'etat, very much orchestrated by the United States, by the CIA, and by basically the State Department. There's a famous and infamous video available, I believe, on YouTube, where Victoria Nuland, one of these American agents in Kiev, is openly discussing who they were going to put in power. And as a result of that, actually, there was a coup d'etat. It was not a revolution, a democratic revolution that brought a new government to power. It was a coup d'etat engineered from abroad with the help of neo-Nazi elements whose existence is today very much denied or minimized in our media, but is very real and very important. It goes back many, many years. Again, we have to look at history, because the neo-Nazis in Ukraine have been around ever since the Second World War and never totally disappeared after the war. Most of them, when the Soviet Union won the war, were actually escaped. Of course, they ran away as fast as they could when the Red Army was on its way, because they knew they'd have to pay for their major war crimes, which they had committed. And they ended up in Germany as what we call here displaced persons, to be later on given passports to be sent off to live happily ever after in countries such as the United States itself. But actually many of them, probably about 20, 30,000 of them, ended up right here in Canada. And that is very important, because one of the granddaughters of one of these Nazi criminals, not one who came to Canada, but actually one of his granddaughters, is today the Vice Prime Minister of Canada. Her name is Chrystia Freeland, and she's openly sympathizes with basically the cause of the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, the Nazis in Ukraine during the war. And she, of course, is a supporter of the regime that was established in Kiev in 2014. And it's fair to say that it's a total baloney to call that regime a democracy. Today, Ukraine is not a democracy. There's most members of the opposition, of serious opposition, are in jail. There's no serious political parties allowed other than the official ones. Russian is not allowed as a language, even though it's a language spoken by the majority of the population. So there's censorship galore. So to call Ukraine now a democracy, and to call this war that the West, the European community, and the European Union and the United States and Canada are now fighting, because we are fighting it against Russia, that the idea that this is a war for democracy is as phony as the idea that the First World War was a war for democracy. And this brings me to the First World War, which is what you asked me about. And it's, of course, it's the mother of all wars of the 20th and even 21st centuries. And that is indeed when that war started. It's fair to say that it didn't really end in 1918. There was a pause, an intermission, and it started again in 1939, even earlier in the Far East when Japan attacked China in 1934, I think it was. And again, that war then ended in 1945. And some historians have been calling that big war then, that started in 1914 and ended in 1945, the Great 30 Years' War of Europe in the 20th century. That's a reference to the very, very tragic, very nasty 30 Years' War that raged in Europe, mostly in Germany, in the 17th century. Well, now actually, but not with the war going on now in Europe, it's probably fair to say that that war that started in 1914, it was not so much a 30 Years' War, but more like a 100 Years' War of the Middle Ages. It looks like it's going to go on for quite some time. And who knows how long this war is going to last. But I can guarantee you that even when it ends, when the fighting ends in Ukraine, that there'll soon be another conflict somewhere else. And here I should say that it's wrong to think of this war in Ukraine as the first war in Europe since the Second World War. We shouldn't forget that what happened in Yugoslavia in the 1990s was definitely very much a war. It's a very similar war, also fought on European soil, actually very, very close to the Western European heartland, just across the water from the Adriatic Sea. So the Italians were very close by. I remember visiting Sicily in the 1990s, and we stayed in a hotel near Trapani in Sicily. And there, some young men came in the evening for dinner, and it turns out they were pilots, American pilots, who had been spending the day, most of the day, bombing Serbia, and were sitting down for a nice dinner of pasta and a glass of red wine, I guess. It was just another day on the job, so to speak, you know. So the war was actually had come back to Europe already in the 1990s. It didn't come back just recently when Putin attacked. And again, Putin's invasion of the Ukraine, which certainly violated international law, is not the first of such violations of international law. The United States has similarly violated international law many, many times. The invasion of Afghanistan, for which you had to pull out a while back, that was against international law. The attack on Iraq, you know, under Saddam Hussein, under false pretenses, that was the violation of international law. So you wonder how valid international law is if we can violate it anytime you want, but the other guys can't. So in a way, it's very, very hypocritical to accuse Putin of violation of international law when Washington has been doing exactly the same thing for many years. In fact, as we speak, the United States has troops in Syria, and they were not invited in as the Russian troops were, Syria considering Russia an ally, and any country is free to ask an ally to bring in troops. But the United States have illegally invaded, occupied part of Syrian territory, about 10 years ago, and are still there, pumping oil out of the ground and shipping it back, selling it off to whoever. So that is a gross violation of international law, but that is never pointed out. Our media don't seem to know that. Similarly, there's other things that Putin's army has done in Ukraine or is accused of doing in Ukraine, about which a big fuss is made. That is done on a daily basis in Palestine. It was in Afghanistan. It still is in Iraq. So some of these things are happening all the time. I have to smile, actually, and cry at the same time when I read in the paper that apparently the Russian warfare in Ukraine is brutal. Now imagine that, brutal warfare. Now contrast that to American warfare in Vietnam, for example, which of course was not brutal at all, except for the use of napalm and a few bombings of cities like Hanoi, you know, but that was not brutal. That was just like basically our way of bringing democracy to them. So it's kind of, it borders on the ridiculous how our media presents some of these things. But to come back to your question about the big picture, what is it then that these wars have in common? These different, you might say, installments of that 100 Years' War that we are experiencing right now, that started in 1914. And the answer is that it has to do with capitalism. It has to do with class struggle. But this is a pretty complex issue. I should say right away, it's very important that there's capitalism. And then there's a particularly aggressive form of capitalism, which is the one that actually we should really focus on right now. And it's called imperialism. It's capitalism in its worldwide manifestation. It's capitalism not limited to one country, but going all over the world, you know, to do its thing, to do what capitalism must do. That is to say, accumulate profits for the big players, for the big corporations and banks. And that is really what these wars have been all about. The First World War was an imperialist war. And that means that there are countries that are heavily industrialized, that have industrialized more than any other countries, and that are therefore extremely productive. They produce all kinds of toys, some of them very important and some not so important, cars, trains, you know, whatever. But they are so productive that they really can't sell whatever they produce, you know, in their own country. So they must sell abroad. They must conquer foreign markets. They must control foreign markets. And indeed, to control them, it often means you must conquer them. And similarly, these industries are so important, and so how should I say, so consuming of raw materials, that it's nearly always impossible for some of these countries, these advanced industrial countries, to find what they need, to find the resources, the raw materials they need in their own country. So they must get control over countries where these materials are to be found and where they can make them available to themselves at low prices. And here now, of course, such as in the beginning of the 20th century, rubber was one such material, but of course oil is the prime example of that. And this brings me to another issue then. A common denominator of all these wars that we've experienced since 1914 is the idea that wars are very profitable, because wars basically are very profitable for what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex in the United States, that nexus of banks and corporations that produce the stuff that one needs to make war, and the weapons, the planes, these are increasingly sophisticated, increasingly expensive. You have to think of one of these new jets that they're now fobbing off on NATO members, like it's the F-35, I believe. One of these toys costs as much as 100 schools or 20 hospitals, of which there's increasingly a shortage now. So it's an enormous waste of money. But the money goes out of the pockets of the taxpayers and flows into the coffers of the big corporations that produce these toys, right? And they make much money that way. So actually warfare, I see and I describe as a way to redistribute the wealth, but in a perverse way. We redistribute the wealth from the poor to the rich. With every war, essentially, the poor become poorer. They pay the price. They do the dying and the killing and all that. And they pay out of their pockets for the cost of the war, because wars are costly, right? At the same time, the profits are privatized. So the costs are socialized, the profits are privatized. So the wealth is distributed, not from the rich to the poor. It doesn't trickle down. That's a bullshit theory developed by Reagan and the boys way back when. It's really all about making money for the big corporations, because imperialism is a way in which the imperialist countries that we refer to as the West, of which the biggies, of course, are the United States, followed by Britain, France, Germany, and then there's little imperialist countries like Belgium and Holland that are also part in it. These countries are not doing their thing and supporting wars because there's money in it for the country. No, there's money in it for the big players in those countries, for the big corporations, for the big banks of those countries, not for the little guys. The little guys are paying for the costs, remember, and the big boys are pocketing the profits. So that is really what a lot of these wars are all about. It's about making money. And you might say, well, why aren't they happy? They are super rich already. The very rich in the United States, the very rich in any country, including Belgium, are so rich already that, why aren't they happy with that? Well, the answer is that the way the capitalist system works now is that the more money you make, you have to invest it so that your money can produce more money. And if it doesn't, well, then you're losing. So you actually must keep on expanding, or the risk basically collapsing. So there has to be something like growth forever. And as you and I know, that's impossible. The Roman Empire experienced that growth forever wasn't possible. And of course, it's true for the present system as well, but they're still trying very hard. And the problem is that indeed, money must be made wherever there's a possibility. So wherever there are countries that have important raw materials, or whose people represent a resource that they want access to, that the imperialist countries want access to at low prices, those countries risk being the object of an aggression under the guise of bringing democracy, of course, under the guise of having a monster, in the charge of their country. So we urgently need regime change. So that is really what the issue is.
I always argue when I speak about foreign policy of the United States and Great Britain and other countries, that these countries, when they invade or when they interfere with other countries, they're not as such against democracy on a principle. What they oppose is the fact that democratic systems tend to put the interests of their own population before the interest of foreign companies of these superpowers. And that is the reason why they oppose democracy in other countries, which explains why for all these years there's this logic of opposing the development, for example, of democracy in South America, Latin America, in Africa, and everywhere. It always has to do with the same thing. These national regimes, whether you like them or not, are trying to say, listen, all these raw materials, the benefits are for us, for our people. And then that is why the US and others, and Europe before that, the European colonists said, well, that's not what we want. We want those ores, those coal mines, those petroleum. That's ours. It may be in yours, but it's ours. And what you emphasize is it's not just greed or want for power, it's also a necessity to survive as a system. Would you agree with that analysis? Where I say it's more than that. It's just it's a lifeblood. They cannot survive without that system.
Yeah. Well, that's what I just said. I think in a way that's one of the problems with the way that the wars are explained now, is that in this non-historical context and ahistorical and non-historical context, is that explanations are given in terms of the individuals. This is like in history, called that the great men of history approach, where everything is explained in terms of this big guy, like the French Revolution, that was Napoleon, the First World War, that was like the Kaiser Wilhelm, William, and the Second World War, that was Churchill, Hitler, de Gaulle, always the big guys who made history supposedly. And we don't look at the systems. We should look at the social economic systems. That is really where we can find an explanation for what happened. So indeed, it has a lot to do with how the system needs to find ways to survive. And surviving is getting control, as I just mentioned, of markets, foreign markets, and of the assets of foreign countries. And one of the mistakes about the war in Ukraine is now is the question, why would the United States want to wage a war against Russia? Because Russia is no longer the Soviet Union. A lot of people understand that the Americans were after the Soviet Union because it's communist, and that's of course bad, because we are capitalist and therefore democratic, and they are communist and therefore not democratic. So that's why we had the Cold War. But the United States won the Cold War, and Russia became, capitalist and democratic. Well, under Yeltsin, the Americans loved the new Russia, but under Putin, they don't. And the reason for that is that Yeltsin did what was expected to happen. Namely, he opened Russia for American investment to come in and help yourself, do whatever you need, as long as there's something in it for me. And that's actually the whole idea of the oligarchs and the corruption in Russia started under the auspices of Yeltsin, who was very anti-democratic, by the way. But he was a darling of the West.
Ukraine.
Yes, and he was a darling of the West. And he made it look like at that stage that all of Russia, all of its resources, its markets would become available to the United States. And that's what Putin put a stop to. Putin was actually the heir to the throne of Yeltsin, and he was expected to continue the same way, but he didn't. Now, Putin is not a communist. He didn't go back to the Soviet system. No, he's very much for capitalism, but he wants a capitalism that focuses on Russia, and at least a capitalism in which there would be some benefits for the ordinary Russians, which there wasn't under Yeltsin. I mean, under Yeltsin, the standard of living in Russia collapsed. And Russia was a hellhole in the 1990s under Yeltsin. The West loved it. Russians hated it. Now, Putin is hated by the West, but many Russians love Putin because he's improved the life of most ordinary Russians. I'm not a supporter of Putin. I don't think Putin is a great guy, but I can see what Putin is trying to do. He realizes that for him also, and for his system that he represents to survive, there has to be some approval from the majority of the Russian population, and that is what he has obtained. In fact, the approval ratings of Putin are very high, but there's still people who hate him, of course, too, in Russia, whose importance is highly exaggerated. But anyways, it brings us to a topic that to be in the crosshairs of American and Western imperialism, that is to say, to become a potential target for wars waged against you, you don't have to become communist or socialist. Some people in the past were, of course, targeted for warfare, direct hot wars or cold wars, because they were communists or because they looked like they were going to go socialist. But as you mentioned, even a capitalist country that steers an independent economic course by limiting, for example, the possibilities for foreign Western banks and corporations to come and do business as they please, that is something these countries are also enemy, so to speak. Saddam Hussein was not a communist. He was not a socialist. He was simply trying to basically get some of the oil revenue, to benefit the people in Iraq. And it's the same in Venezuela today. That's the big sin of these guys, and that's why war was waged on them. I mean, warfare is, as I mentioned, by itself, any war against any country is profitable for the people who produce the weapons, for the military-industrial complex. But the Americans have not at any recent time thought of starting a war against Canada, for example, or Mexico. No, because we are open for their business. They can come and help themselves to whatever they want, right? But what they hate is countries that they go to countries where there's something to be had. They went into Iraq because of the oil, And now is the idea of going? What is behind the idea of going into Ukraine, which is what happened in 2014? Most people don't know what happened in 2014. But in 2014, Ukraine's economy was in shambles, and the then president of the Ukraine was actually trying to make a deal to improve the economy including by getting some money, by getting some loans. And he contacted both Russia and the West. And Russia was willing to play ball, especially since economically, Russia and Ukraine have always been linked. Now, the West was willing to play ball too. But the West, that means the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. That means loaning you money at interest rates to be paid back in dollars and on our conditions, which means privatization, which means austerity, which means all these things. So having pondered all this, that president decided then to go for the Russian deal, which was far less onerous, to Ukraine. And that, of course, that's when the Americans intervened, because in a Ukrainian arrangement with Russia, there was nothing in it for them. And now, via coup d'etat, they brought a regime to power that is willing to give the Americans whatever they want. And I've been reading recently, and maybe you know more about that, but I've been reading recently now how most of the wonderful, very rich agricultural land in Ukraine has been sold at bargain basement prices to American corporations like Monsanto. And that's what they're in for. But that's why the Nazis wanted Ukraine already in the 1940s. Yeah.
That's absolutely right. I know a lot about this because I have a background in agricultural science. Ukraine, actually, the soil there, most of the soil, it's just butter, it's so rich. And that is the real prize that's to be won by Monsanto and all the others. In fact, President Zelensky, who, by the way, was raised in Russian, although he identifies as Ukrainian, which is his right, but he was raised in Russian and learned Ukrainian in school. But when he was president, instead of doing his promises, one of the things that he did was change the laws that permit foreign companies to buy agricultural land. And indeed, already more than 30% of the agricultural lands, Ukraine was the grain harvester of the Soviet Union and of a lot of part of the world, has been sold already to foreign Western companies. On top of that, he has changed the law so that these companies can fire and hire at will. And the unions, most of the unions are forbidden. So that is the situation with this president. In fact, right before the war started, his popularity was at an all-time low, like with all the presidents before him. So the thing is now, I visited Ukraine, Kiev, in 1996 with the delegation of the Belgian Parliament back in the day. And they also discussed with us this importance of the language issue, which is just a small layer on top of the all issues that you put, but you cannot deny that it is there. When you say that a majority of the Ukrainian people speak Russian, what you mean is they can speak that language, but there are, that's a fact also, more Ukrainians who identify as Ukrainians than as Russian. Now, I'm perfectly okay with whatever people want to identify with. It's just that doesn't give you the right to start oppressing the others because they don't agree with you. And that's part of the problem. When you said the war actually started in 2014, when these parts of in the East said, hey, one of the first things that this coup regime did was forbid the Russian language in the schools, in the institution, etc., etc. Well, and then after that, they started to protest, and there's been a civil war, internal war going on from 2014 until now. And one of the reasons, you can condemn the invasion for whatever happened in it, but as you said, this war started in 2014, not in February this year. And this is what I meant in the beginning: context and history, which is totally absent from what the media tell us about this war, which so people cannot understand what is really going on. And that is why the work of people like you is so important, to give this background, to say, listen, guys, I mean, before the war, Putin was a very welcome guy in the business circles here. Before the Second World War, Hitler and Mussolini, they were on the cover of Time magazine, you know? And it's always that. Why? Because wars are about economics and about geostrategy. And this is why it's so important that for people to read books like these. Anyway, Jacques, thank you very much for your insights. Are there any more comments that you would like to give on the issue?
Yes, I would like to say, maybe finish by saying that the war will go on for a while. We don't know yet how long, and we don't know yet how it will end. But I can tell you one thing, the war is not just a war between Ukraine and Russia. It's very much a war between the West, led by the United States against Russia. And I can tell you that the Americans have already reached their objectives in that war. In other words, they have in some ways won the war already. And what I mean by that is that for them, it's not important really what happens to the Ukrainians, how many are killed. That doesn't really matter. They don't really care. What I'm saying is the war, the function of the war is also economic. It's really there to create the demand for American products. The war has allowed the United States to go to all NATO members and tell them, look, guys, see that big threat from Russia. You need to buy more weapons from us because we need to be ready, because when Putin is done with Ukraine, he'll attack Estonia and Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and soon he'll be rolling, his tanks will be rolling through to Belgium and to Holland. Therefore, you guys must spend more money, spend less money on hospitals, spend less money on schools and frivolous things like that, buy F-35s from us. And that is what's happening. And look at it, even Finland, is now thinking of joining NATO, which is a stupid idea. But again, it's a wonderful idea for the Americans because that means more weapons to be sold to Finland now. So that is where the money is. And even if this war ends, as I think it will, with Ukraine ending up as a small landlocked country without access to the Black Sea, and certainly the Crimea and all that will be forever Russians, that's really not important compared to the advantage that American industry is already harvesting right now. And I got to tell you right now, about something happened here in Canada. Just yesterday, Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, arrived here in Ottawa, welcomed with open arms by the granddaughter of the Ukrainian Nazi, who is the daughter, who is the granddaughter, who is now the vice prime minister of Canada. And he's here to negotiate a deal because Germany's going to buy gas from Canada, natural gas. So you can see how cutting off, forcing Germany not to buy gas from Russia is going to be a windfall for the oil and gas producers in the United States and Canada. Because one of the reasons why Canada, of course, is a loyal ally of the United States is that the big corporations in Canada profit from, are mostly owned by American companies anyways, and they profit from wars as well. That's why Canada is always there to move into Afghanistan, for example, to move in, and any war, we're there on the side of Uncle Sam. Mm-hmm. So economically already, you could say militarily, the war in Ukraine is going very badly for the West, but economically, it's doing very, very well. Thank you very much. Money is being made and it's going to the pockets of the ones who already have lots of it, but who never have enough.
At the same time, there is a big, major difference with the First Cold War. One might argue, did this Cold War ever end? And also to add, this Cold War was actually a very hot war in Africa, in Latin America. Let's not forget that.
Vietnam and Korea.
Yeah, in those countries, it was a very hot war. But what I mean to say, there is, in the long term, a big difference, namely the First Cold War, Russia and China were opposed to each other, among other things, by the US working there. And this might be different this time. What do you think?
Well, obviously, the United States has a major concern. One of the problems in the United States today is that 20 years ago, when the Cold War ended, presumably with a wonderful victory for the West, for the United States, it looked as if the United States was then the only superpower. It would be a unipolar world, and it was supposed to stay like that forever. It was the end of history, as one of these academic nuts called his book at one point. You remember that? Well, it's now 30 years later, and the United States is no longer the world's superpower. There's now three superpowers essentially, but the number one is definitely China. If it's not number one already, it's going to be anytime soon, economically and militarily. Russia is not nearly as big an economic power. It's only economically as big as maybe, not even as big as Germany, I believe, economically, but militarily, Russia is very, very powerful. So in a competition now, in a three-way competition, the United States would have a hard time already just against China alone, economically and militarily also. And against Russia, militarily, they'd have a very hard time. That's one of the reasons why they don't dare to institute a no-fly zone in Ukraine, because the Russians haven't even started that war yet. They're only using some of their troops in a very limited sort of way. They haven't really gone all out. So the big danger for the United States is that China and Russia together would be certainly against them. The United States would be no match. Oddly enough, their policy in Ukraine is driving China and Russia together, because the Americans are also actually acting very aggressively towards China. Look at what's been happening with respect to Taiwan. So the Chinese are now ready, getting ready and looking to the Russians. The Russians are looking at the Chinese. So actually the way that the United States have been behaving is driving those two together, which is not to the advantage of the Americans.
The one of the problems, I agree with you on the economic analysis, which in the short term, the US profits enormously. But there is another thing that hangs over all this, that let's not forget that on the nuclear level, Russia and the United States are still equal to the two big ones in the world, not China. And actually, what I believe is we're playing with fire there. I mean, I'm not considering the thing that there would be a conscious decision to start a nuclear war, but the risk of accident, it's actually already a miracle that ever since nuclear arms exist, that there have never been a start of a war, nuclear war, by accident or by misunderstanding. And this conflict in Ukraine, to me, is a very risk on that issue. Would you agree?
Yes, it's definitely very risky business. In fact, that's the big problem in the background is the possibility of this war exploding, no pun intended, into a major war in which atomic weapons would be used. And that's the result then would be a catastrophe for all of us, even for mankind as in general, because very likely there would be some nuclear winter or some such phenomenon, which would probably ruin the climate for the next 100 years and would probably mean that most of us would suffer the consequences.
What worries me also in the short term, there will be parliamentary elections in the United States in coming November. I mean, the Republican Party, Noam Chomsky calls the Republican Party the most dangerous organization in the world for the survival of humankind. If you see those, sorry for the use of the word, nutcases, that are going to be probably have the majority in the Congress, and if you consider the possibility that Trump or one of his clones would become president again, that is something to worry about. And that is one of the reasons why we should really try to find on the European level a diplomatic solution to the conflict in Ukraine.
Well, I'm not so sure about that, meaning that in the United States, I know that Trump has been the black beast for a while now, and the Republican Party, and they are a bunch of very, very, very dangerous party, that's for sure. But I mean, excuse me, the Democratic Party is no better than that. I mean, they had a president called Obama it was president for 8 years. He actually bombed more countries and waged more war than his predecessor, George W. Bush.
Absolutely.
And today, Biden is the guy actually, who's under whose auspices the war in Ukraine has been provoked, because we keep on hearing here all the time how Putin's attack was unprovoked. And here we say in English, thou protest too much, they're constantly saying unprovoked. It was provoked. It was definitely provoked in many ways, and we don't have time to talk about how and why, but it was a provoked war. So essentially, this war now was provoked under the auspices of the Biden administration. While I also despise Trump, in fact, I despise any American president of the last 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, 80 years. Trump was a nitwit. He was actually, in some ways, more rational than some of democratic presidents we've had in the past, including Obama. He was actually had the good sense of saying that we should really deal with Putin, you know, and talk to the man. Now, because when he said that, immediately Democrats accused him of being Putin's man, you know, a spokesman for Moscow, which is nonsense. But the idea that basically the Americans, President and Putin, should talk and try to find some way out of their problems rather than hurling insults at each other and demonizing each other, I think that's in itself a pretty good starting point. I wish a guy like Biden would say that, but he doesn't. Of course, he doesn't know what he's saying anyways. He doesn't even get to manage to say anything. So that's a problem also. So I have no illusions. I agree that the Democrats, that the Republicans are useless in many ways. But I think you can say the same thing about the Democrats. It's pretty hopeless right now. I mean, essentially, in the United States, the choices is awful. That's why most Americans don't vote, because if I would be given a choice to vote between a Republican and a Democratic candidate, I wouldn't bother wasting my time driving to the polling station to vote. It's not worthwhile. I wouldn't even have voted for Obama, because I didn't fall for the BS that he was going to be wonderful. Never. Obama was supposedly a black president. Well, he did nothing for blacks in 8 years of presidency. You know, in fact, the whole movement, basically the pushback from the black community, started under Obama, you know, not under Trump.
Absolutely. You're quite right. When I say the Republicans are dangerous, I'm thinking of, igniting a war by accident or by misunderstanding. But you're absolutely right. The Democrats are just the same bunch. They might have different rhetoric and sound, but they're just, it's all the same policy, namely maintain US dominance over the world, which is getting harder and harder. Anyway, Jacques, thank you very much for your insight. We're going to wrap up here. I also want to thank our followers. If you like this interview, please don't forget to support us and to subscribe on the little button there to a YouTube account. Anyway, Jacques, goodbye.
Take care. Bye-bye.